Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Greg and the museum for inviting me. And also, this is part of the Florida Humanities Council Talks, who are also helping sponsor this. So I thank them for making this all possible for us as well. This, my book, Tracing Florida Journeys, is a 20-year project that I've been working on because I'm, maybe like you, I'm a huge Florida history nerd and a Florida literature nerd. And so one of my favorite things to do over the years is to read different accounts of Florida by different people who came through and then try to go find the places where they visited. I have dragged my family many places they did not want to go, but it always became interesting. And so this is something I've been working on for a long time, and it was my pleasure during COVID that this became my big project. While I was teaching online and not seeing anybody in person, this became my relief as well. So the idea behind this book, again, is to follow famous people who came through Florida during different time periods and went to different parts of the state. There are plenty of people who came through and wrote about it, but I wanted to make sure that it was representative of certain periods. So you may know plenty of other travelers who came through, but the ones I've chosen to talk about in my book, and I've actually narrowed it down for tonight to save time, are all representative of something important. And I'm going to give you a little piece, a little hint about each one of them. Let me note that at the end of every chapter, there's a bit of a travelogue that hopefully you'll pick up and go visit some of these sites as well. And maybe you'll pick up the books also that these authors were talking about too. I'm a huge William Bartram fan, and some of you may be too. You know, he came to New Smyrna Beach in the 1760s. But in my account, I use his travels through Florida when he came through by himself in 1773 and 1774. Billy, as his father called him, was a really interesting person. He was a Quaker from Philadelphia during the time it was an English colony. He was a self-taught naturalist. His father had been the botanist to King George, and at a time when it was totally cool to be collecting plants and samples from this new world, this wild place, and growing them in your own arboretum to kind of show off to the neighbors, right? So Billy had been with his father on some trips one trip to Florida, and what they discover is that in the ensuing years is that Billy is not a businessman. He had a plantation that failed up on the St. Johns River. He had tried working in a store. He really wasn't good at anything except art. He was a great artist. And his father had actually used him to go with him to draw pictures of specimens and things that they had seen. So when Billy gets the opportunity, he finds a rich botanical collector in England who decides to sponsor him for a trip into this new area. And it isn't just Florida, it's also the entire southeastern colonies in England at the time. If you ever travel to different places around, you may see Bartram Trail signs. There's one this is one at Pontoon Island. So he's been memorialized in many places and in many different states as well. 10 years after he got back from his travels, in which he kept journals, he sent samples back through different outposts, he writes a book that you can see has a very long title, but we just call it Bartram's Travels. But it gives you an idea of all the places he went in, and it's published in Philadelphia in 1791, and it was well received, but it's not greatly received until it's published in England in 1792. It inspired British poets. And we know that Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan is based in part on a spring description that Bartram talked about. He wrote about Salt Spring and how beautiful and how peaceful it seemed to be and how the animals and fish all seemed to get along. And so that inspires a scene from that poem as well. We know that was the Romantic period in England, and so many of these authors in England were following Bartram. Again, Florida's unusual. It's wilderness, right? It's the great unknown. We do know that Bartram described more than 600 species while he was in Florida, and I'm going to point out the one on the right. It's called Bartram's Ixia. It was not seen after he described it. And so for many years, botanists and scientists poo-pooed Billy and said, well, this doesn't really exist. Some of his descriptions are very flowery, and we don't know how accurate he was. And then in the 1930s, it was found. And now you can buy it commercially up in Northeast Florida. They grow it there. I met a lady who has them in her yard. So that was just kind of a fun story. He just happened to be at the right place at the right time to find these different things. Importantly, Bartram writes about some places that others had not really described very much. He, on one of his well, let me just say, first, he's mostly traveling up and down the St. Johns River in a boat by himself with a sail. But every now and then he joins in with some other people. And in one trip, he travels with some traders to Payne's Prairie, which you may now know is now a state park. At the time, however, it was overseen by a Seminole tribe, and particularly a chief known as Ahaya. These traders were welcomed. They smoked a peace pipe. They had food with the Seminoles, and the chief was so impressed with Bartram that he gave him a name, Puck Puggy, which means flower gatherer or flower hunter. But we think that perhaps that gave him safe passage too, because the Seminole chief had met him and seen that he was not someone dangerous. He was someone that should be traveling safely around. The top left picture is a picture of Payne's Prairie before it got flooded a few years ago. Bartram saw wolves on the prairie. His accounts are so fascinating. And importantly, when the preserve was acquired by the state, the land managers wanted to figure out what it should look like, how to restore it. Because it had a lot of dikes and ditches, and they went back to Bartram's travels to get a good description of what Payne's Prairie should look like. They still have Bartram Days one weekend out of every year to celebrate him, and it's a lot of fun. On the top left, we're not sure who this is, but it's his drawing of a Seminole chief. And while others had come through Florida before and saw all the Florida natives as dangerous, pagan, wild people, Bartram was fascinated. He thought they were interesting and noble, and so he gives us these accounts of the native people he meets along the way. His accounts become really important when he travels up through Georgia, South Carolina, and the Carolinas, and you can almost read some of his stuff as anthropological, the way he looks at the different tribes there too. In Florida, though, he was really obsessed with the plants, and this was his Eden in a large sense. This is a spot on the St. Johns River that I've been to multiple times. My friend Clay Henderson and I have decided that is the spot where Bartram likely had his encounters with alligators, which is a really crazy part of his book. It's fascinating. He talks about alligators attacking his boat, grabbing the fish on his line, coming up on shore. He even shot one of them. And he also describes alligators lining up in the St. Johns River, head to head, and waiting as a large school of fish came toward them, and they were eating the fish together. Again, scientists like, we haven't seen that. And look at his drawings of alligators. They look more like dragons, This is a bit fanciful, but now we know that scientists have actually described this as crocodilian feeding behavior, cooperative feeding, and it's been observed in South America. So maybe he just saw something at the right time at the right place. Maybe the shad run up the St. John's, right? Anyway, he camped on this island, and I love to think about this as a place that has seen many of the authors in my book. Certainly, Bartram came through here. We know that Audubon had a picnic here, we think. Marjorie Rawlings and Harriet Beecher Stowe both took trips up and down the St. Johns River, and they probably passed right by here. So it's a really interesting spot. Again, I dragged my family there and they didn't know what we were doing. John James Audubon comes like 50 years after Bartram, and he's coming to find birds, and they have to be new birds, right? Because what he has made a business of doing is drawing American birds and creating prints of them and then selling them to subscribers, maybe many rich people in England and in the Northeast. And he needs new birds because he needs new subscribers, right? He needs to sell some more prints as well. He styled himself as the American woodsman. Check out the long hair, the leather jacket, the gun. I mean, this is how he liked to present himself, and while he was trying to sell his subscriptions. So he comes to Florida, and he sends, right away, he's on the St. Johns River in St. Augustine area, and right away he sends a letter to his wife and says, well, I don't know about these flowery sayings of Mr. Bartram, because I'm not seeing, this isn't so beautiful to me. This is buggy and cold and sandy, and the people seem worthless, and but it wasn't what he was looking for, right? So when he finally got on a Navy cutter and went down to the Keys, then he is happy. Because now he's finding beautiful wading birds, different colors and huge numbers. And not only does he go to the Keys, he also catches a boat all the way out to Dry Tortugas, which is 70 miles off of Key West. And he writes beautiful prose about the people he meets and the birds that he encounters as well. Now, a couple little trivia things you probably already know. He tried to make all of his prints actual life size of these birds. Therefore, the flamingo had to lean over because he couldn't fit that in, right? And another thing, this is a booby gannet, not the prettiest bird, but one of the things to look for in his prints is the background. He brought an artist with him to draw the backgrounds, and in this case, it's a picture of Indian Key, which at the time was the county seat. And it was burned a few years afterwards. But it is a really interesting place that you can still go visit, and it's another way to look at Audubon prints. So things get better in South Florida for Audubon, and let's be honest, we associate him today with the name Saving Birds, right? But back then there were no big telescopes or telephoto lenses or really good binoculars. And so the way he managed to get birds to copy was to kill them. And he shot hundreds of birds. They would take what he thought was the best specimen, put wire in it to pose it, and from there he would do his drawings as well. And sometimes I ate them for dinner. I mean, I have to say. He didn't see that they were ever going to run out. So this is an interesting point about him. Later, he becomes associated with Saving Birds because he makes us love them, from his drawings as well. So he's an interesting character. Following him today, I was able to go down to the Keys right before COVID hit, and I got to tour Indian Key with Jerry and Linda Lawrence. Jerry is the chief ornithologist for the Audubon Florida, which is their new name, and he's doing extensive research on roseate spoonbills and now on the new flamingo populations that have shown up, right? And he's quite concerned about flamingos because they were in Florida when the Endangered Species Act was enacted, and he's trying to make sure that they have good protections now that they are showing up. I heard there were maybe 27 up at Merritt Island last week. That's so cool. Anyway, then my photographer friend Bruce Hunt, who did all the photos here, he and I took a seaplane ride out to Dry Tortugas, where we saw thousands of terns nesting. And the Dry Tortugas isn't just one island, it's many, and many are protected just as nesting sites. And so I stood there and I looked at all these birds and thought, wow, maybe this is what Audubon saw. Maybe you can still see. I mean, I certainly felt the sense of wonder at seeing them as well. John Muir. We all know John Muir, right? And we associate him with California, Sierra Mountains, Sierra Club, right? But before John Muir was John Muir, he came to Florida. And not a lot of people know that. As a young man, he had been a really good inventor, and he'd gone to work in a factory. And one day in the factory, a file slipped and hit him in the eye and caused blindness in his eye. And then his other eye, he said, went blind as sympathetic blindness. And while he's in a dark room with bandages on his face, he makes a deal with God. He says, if I get better, I am going to finally take that trip I've always wanted to take. I'm going to walk from Indiana to Florida, and then I'm going to get a boat to South America, and I'm finally going to see all these exotic places that I've always wanted to see. Like Bartram, he is a botanist. He's interested in plants, and so he indeed takes that, he gets well, and he walks, again, like he promised, from Indiana. He goes to Mammoth Cave, and he walks all the way to Savannah. Importantly, this is 1867. This is 2 years after the Civil War, and he's walking through some very war-torn areas. So he has a lot of observations about that. This is his journal that he kept that you can look online through the Sierra Club and see. But as you can see, he was keeping a journal and he was drawing also, and he was fascinated by Florida palms, just fascinated. He puts in the cover, John Muir, Earth, Planet, Universe. Not our normal guy, right? But he takes off on this long trip, and when he gets to Florida, he's ecstatic. He has to catch a steamboat from Savannah to Fernandina, and he gets off the boat in Fernandina, and he wants to get away from people. He buys a loaf of bread, and he takes off, and he's decided he's going to follow the rail lines through Florida. 2 reasons. First of all, there are no trains running in 1867. It's post-war, the railroad lines are a mess, but as you probably recognize, Florida can be a very tangled wilderness, and he sees that the rail lines are an easy way to walk. And you're safe, you got a long vision, right? And there aren't a lot of weeds around you. So he starts off, he stops and takes a nap under a tree, and he hears a huge rustle. And it wakes him up, and what does he think he's seeing?
Black bear.
Yeah, alligator. He's afraid it's an alligator, and he jumps. But remember, this is what he wants to see in Florida. This is why people come to Florida, to see an alligator, right? And instead it's a big white bird. And he's quite embarrassed, but he admits, that maybe he was tired and all. He also fell in love with Florida's magnolias. And as you can see from this line here, he says, I'm now in the hot gardens of the sun where palm meets pine, I longed for and often visited in dreams. He is now in his paradise. And his writing while he's in Florida is absolutely fascinating. It's an easy, quick book to read. I have my students read it. And you can see as he starts wandering through Florida, he's starting to reconsider the human place in the world. And he starts to think to himself, all animals and plants are all God's creatures. Why should humans be at a higher level when God has created all of these things? And so we start to see him kind of what we would call transcendental thinking. And he really finds God and spirit and nature. And Florida really becomes a paradise for him. He almost dies. And that is the crazy part of this story. When he gets to Cedar Key, he becomes very ill with malaria and is nursed for 3 months before he gets back to health. And it's a scary story, and it's a scary thought that he never would have made it to California and done all the work he did do. He does get on a boat, but he decides he's not going to go to South America because, this malaria, he's not quite over it, that might be a bad idea. So he goes on a boat to New York and then ends up going out to California, and then, again, finds his real home is in the Sierra Mountains. Retracing it, I don't know how many of you have been to Cedar Key, but it's one of my favorite places. On the top left is Merrill Clark, who lives in Gainesville, who impersonates Muir. So you can get an idea of what Muir was wearing. He carried a plant press over one shoulder, a small bag over another that didn't have much in it. And twice people tried to rob him and then took a look in the bag and handed it back and said, there's nothing here that you could possibly want. Some friends of mine, because we were trying to refine the trail, we determined that there's at least one piece of the former rail line that he would have walked on that would have connected into downtown Gainesville. So on a very cold January day, we all gathered together and we walked on what's now a Rails to Trails line into downtown Gainesville, and that was really fun. This is my photographer, Bruce. We're at the Island Hotel. If some of you have been there, it's like the coolest mural on any bar in Florida I maintain. And then last spring, I took my students to Cedar Key after they had read Muir, and we stood at the final pilings where the rail line once crossed the water. And we stood there and we thought about, this is Muir. This is the end of his trip, and saw a beautiful sunset. But one of the interesting things, as Muir says, as he's approaching Cedar Key, he smells the salt air, and he says it reminded him immediately of his childhood in Scotland near the water. Haven't we all done that? When the salt water's there as you're approaching it. So it's a really wonderful way to connect with him as well. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Abraham Lincoln said, so you're the little lady who started the war, right? Because of her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that had really helped create sympathy for the abolitionist movement in the United States. Well, after the war was over, Stowe comes to Florida and buys a home on the St. Johns River on a bluff in the Mandarin community. Her husband's not well, and their main home is in Connecticut, but she feels like he needs to get out of these cold winters. Therefore, she's a snowbird, right? And they buy this beautiful home. You can see a picture of the family on this porch here as well. And she kind of becomes a tourist attraction. Boats were going up and down the St. Johns, and they'd stop and look at her, and some people would get off the boat and go grab branches off her orange trees, and she did some painting as well, and she really enjoyed Mandarin. And one of the things that she had been told she needed to do was to take a steamboat up the Ocklawaha River to Silver Springs. It's really the premier tourist attraction in the 1800s. So in 1873, she gets on a steamboat, which would have looked much like this, goes down or up the Ocklawaha River, and it's an overnight trip. It's a wooden boat. Note how narrow it is. That's because the Ocklawaha is narrow and very twisty, and so it took a long time. In the morning, she said they woke up and there they were at Silver Springs. And so here's a picture of an old boat coming into the springs, and then of today's, glass bottom boat that you can go and visit. But she writes this beautiful piece for her brother's newspaper up in the north, and she talks about, we have been to fairyland. And the descriptions are just amazing, just beautiful. It's a beautiful account. Today, you can still travel on the Ocklawaha River. You can get a sense of the twistiness, but you can't traverse the whole thing. It was dammed in the Cross Florida Barge Canal construction project in the 1960s. So you can go down part of it, but you can't complete the trip to Silver Springs, which is a bit of a problem because there's a lot of manatees and fish that would like to go up there as well. Karen Chadwick took me out on her boat, and she's one of the people fighting to get the dam removed as well. On the far right is the Episcopal Church that Stowe helped found in Mandarin. And for a long time there was a stained glass window dedicated to her husband, but unfortunately it got damaged in a hurricane in the 60s, and so it's no longer there. Stephen Crane. You should know Stephen Crane because his grand adventure was off the shores of Volusia County, right? But we first know him as the author of The Red Badge of Courage, which is a story of the Civil War battle and a young man's experiences there as well. Big bestseller. But a problem for Stephen Crane because he caught a lot of criticism because he had never been in war. He had never been in a battle. And so he comes to Florida trying to prove himself as a worthy man, to be writing these stories. And he comes to St. Augustine hoping to get on a boat headed for Cuba that was going to carry illegal arms for the Cubans who are now fighting with the Spanish. And he wants to be a war correspondent. And this is how he's going to do it. And while he's waiting for a ride on the boat, he meets his future wife, Cora, who ran a somewhat questionable hotel in downtown Jacksonville. A lot of interesting activities probably went on there, but they are inseparable later on. And Cora styles herself as a war correspondent as well and travels with him after his whole incident here. So he gets on the Commodore, which is a boat out of Jacksonville, and he heads out. It's January 1897. It's a cold night. And as you may know, Jacksonville is not on the coast. So on their way out the river, they managed to hit 2 sandbars along the way, which they thought everything was fine until they got out into the open ocean and they start taking on water. And ultimately, the boat sinks off the coast of Volusia County. We know now exactly where it was, but at the time, his main way of finding his way back was looking at the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, which was operating then, and that's what they looked at, that light in the middle of the night. And he ends up in a small dinghy rowing with the captain who's broken his arm and with 2 other men, and they're rowing and rowing for many, many hours. And he recounts this in his story, The Open Boat, which you can read online. Hemingway thought it was one of the best written short stories ever. So it's a really fascinating account. Today, if you go to the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, there's a lovely museum at the base of it that also has some of the artifacts from the Commodore. Well, how did they find it? Partly through the work of Elizabeth Friedman. She is a professor, an English professor in Jacksonville, had taught The Open Boat to her students, was fascinated by this whole story, knew the Commodore had never been located, and she's a scuba diver. So she got a group together and they all went out and spent some time and located finally the wreck of the Commodore. It took a few years before it was absolutely verified by archaeologists, but she's really proud of having been part of that, and it helps build the story and lets us know what happened. You should know, headlines said the day after the accident, Stephen Crane dies in boating accident. He didn't, and Cora, who's back in Jacksonville, is very upset, but he sends her a telegram and says, I'm okay, and he convalesced in Daytona Beach. She came down to get him, and then the 2 of them took off to go be war correspondents in Europe, and that's a whole other story as well. Zora Neale Hurston is now widely considered one of the best in African-American authors in U.S. literature. She is a really fascinating person, and while she doesn't take one long journey in Florida, she does spend a lot of time in 3 different communities writing about the people she met there and recording their memories, their poetry, their folk tales, their songs. And she's very much celebrated in Eatonville, which she claimed as her hometown. She wasn't born there. She kind of fudged on that. She kind of fudged on her age a lot during the course of her life, depending on what suited her. But she's such a fascinating person. When you come into Eatonville, you'll see this big archway, and on the archway is this lovely brass plaque of, noting her contributions to the city. And this is one of my favorite portraits. It's on a basketball court in Eatonville as well. There's an annual Hurston Festival in Eatonville every January, and it's a really big celebration, and it's a lot of fun. I highly recommend it. A lot of it's online that you might be able to participate in. 2 of my favorite stories of her are trips that she takes to collect folklore. She ends up as part of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and 30s, and she is mixing, with really important arts people in Harlem during this period of time, but she also gets the opportunity to go to Barnard College and get a degree in anthropology. And part of her research, she gets funded by a rich woman to come down to Florida and record stories. So one of the places she goes is to a sawmill in Polk County, and where she literally stays with the workers and records their stories. She parties with them. I mean, she really gets to know them. But it almost didn't happen, because when she came to the sawmill, she's driving her new car that she was so proud of, and her new dress. And they took one look at her and decided that she must be a federal agent that was out to, arrest them for whatever activities. And so she said she had to think really quick, and she told them, oh no, this is my boyfriend's car, he's a moonshiner, he's on the lam, we're hiding out. So they invited her in, and into their lives, and into their, into their stories, and again, she's such a chameleon. She could go to Barnard and mix with the academics, and then she could go to a sawmill and talk with the local workers, which I don't think anyone else possibly could have done this. Another trip she does as part of the Writers Project in Florida during the Depression is she goes to a turpentine camp near Cross City in an area called Shamrock, which no longer exists. These are my students standing. It's the only artifact we could find. It's Shamrock. It's on Highway 19 next to a Hardee's. But her tales were fascinating. She was sent by this project to go talk to the turpentine workers and get them primed and gain their confidence, so that when a crew of white people showed up with the tape recorders, that they would be willing to tell their stories and tell their folklore. Stetson Kennedy was one of the guys with the tape recorder, if you're familiar with Stetson. He was a wonderful historian, and so they worked together. So these are just some of her stories. Again, I just don't think that anybody else could have done this. When I went to try to find the sawmill, it's long gone. I found the rail line. I found an old street marker there, and a really large Publix. So, yeah. But if you want to see Hurston stuff, right now, I think one of the best places is Fort Pierce. She spent the final years of her life in Fort Pierce. This was the house where she lived. She paid rent for a while, and then when she couldn't, the family let her stay on there. She worked part-time at the local all-black high school, where she was an English teacher. And after she suffered some strokes, she ended up at the county-run all-black nursing home, where she eventually had a second stroke and died in the hospital. Years ago in the 80s, the author Alice Walker went looking for Zora and literally went to find her graveyard and realized that her body had been buried in an all-black cemetery with no marker at all. So Walker set out to remedy that. And she walked through, there's this great story that she wrote, and she talks about walking through the weeds and screaming, "Zora, where are you?" And then finds like an indentation in the ground and decides that must be the site. And so she paid to memorialize the grave. And since then, as you can see, other memorials have popped up. And you may be able to see here that the city of Fort Pierce has now created a Dust Tracks Heritage Trail that you can look at online and get a brochure, and you can go visit at least 10 sites that are all places that Zora worked or would have visited in her lifetime as well. A group in Fort Pierce has gotten a big state grant, and they hope later this year that they'll be opening the former nursing home as a museum. Not just for Zora, but also for other notable members of the African American community in Fort Pierce. Here's some trivia for you. At the high school where she taught, some of the young men later became the highwaymen, right? And some were pallbearers at her funeral. And I met James Gibson years later and said, "Oh yeah, we knew who she was, you know." And at her funeral, about 200 people showed up. They recognized who she was. She may have been forgotten nationally, but she was well known locally. So that's a fun story. And when I've been to her grave, there's always something new there. People leave food offerings, teapots, I mean, all kinds of things there for her. So it's, in a sense, kind of a pilgrimage site. I'm going to finish by talking about Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, and first I have to do a disclaimer. I'm on the board of trustees for the Marjorie Rawlings Society. I'm a huge fan. That's just the way it is. Of course, I'm a huge fan of all of these authors, actually, if you haven't figured that out yet. Marjorie, I love this story, is a woman who comes to Florida on an adventure and falls in love. How many of you have read one of her books? Quite a few. I highly, highly recommend them. So she and her husband Charles had been working as newspaper writers in Rochester, New York, and they decide that this is not the life they want. She's writing a column called Poems of the Housewife, or Songs of the Housewife, yes. It was syndicated, she was making money, but it just wasn't what she wanted to do. She wanted to write gothic romance books, and they just didn't have the time, and Charles wanted to write about the yachting industry and water and boating, and so they have this grand idea. Marjorie comes into an inheritance, and they say, let's buy an orange grove in Florida, because certainly the oranges will pay for us to just be full-time writers. Now, you know how well that goes, right? Yeah. So after 3 years, they've lost almost all their money, and they are living in the town, or the hamlet of Cross Creek, which is between Gainesville and Ocala. Back where the citrus industry was once centered, but no longer because of freezes and everything else. Charles, this is not his thing. Charles realizes pretty quickly that this is not where he wants to be. He hangs in there for a few years, and ultimately they split. But I want you to see this picture of the house. It's now part of the state park. You can go visit it. This is actually in really good shape versus what they found when they arrived. They bought it sight unseen. And on this screened-in porch is where she would sit and write her books on her manual typewriter. And the neighbors said sometimes they could hear the typing from far away. But she would be on the screen porch because, there is no air conditioning, right? And she even had a little cot there where she would take a nap sometimes, like old Floridians. So here we have this Yankee woman who comes down, falls in love with Florida, falls in love with the people, and begins writing about the people and finds out that that's really where her talent lies. all of her papers are now at the University of Florida Archives, and on the left is one of the papers, the beginning of her book, The Yearling. And you can see how it's on old typewriters, and it's hand edited, and had even been taped at the bottom of the page. And it's so fascinating to go see this. The Yearling is published in 1938. It wins the Pulitzer Prize the next year, and now her career is really set. She's making money. She gets an indoor toilet. It's very exciting. But by this point, Charles is gone, and she has to, she's on her own, but really relying on the local community. And she writes about a lot of this in her semi-autobiographical book, Cross Creek, which was published in 1942. She never mentions Charles in that book, interestingly, and it's a bit out of order as to what things were going in her life. But one of my favorite things is a chapter near the end of it called Hyacinth Drift. And in this chapter, she tells the story of taking a boat trip with her friend Desi Smith. Now, Desi was a local backwoods gal. She knew how to hunt and fish, and they had become pals. And one night, they're sitting up having some of Leonard's moonshine, they said, and commiserating, and Marjorie's really sad. Charles, it looks like they're getting a divorce. She's got writer's block. She, the world just isn't looking happy to her. And Desi said, well, I know what you need. You need to go on a river trip. And we're going to go on the St. Johns River on a trip I've always wanted to take, and you're going to come with me. And so they agree that night, that's what they're going to do. The next morning, Rollins tries to back out, and Desi says, too late, I'm already making plans. So in March of, 1931, I'm trying to get out of the way of the picture, they take off in a wooden boat from Highway 50 at the St. Johns River. They put in just the two of them in Desi's boat with a little outboard motor, and they travel up the St. Johns River, down the St. Johns River, to the Ocklawaha River, the Ocklawaha again, right? And where they turn and they head up and end up in the Ocala National Forest where Desi had a camp. On this trip, Rollins comes to the realization of the beauty of nature and feels healed and becomes self-sufficient. It was a story I fell in love with. It took me years to find a woman who would go do the trip with me. But I did, and when we took the boat trip, it was just wonderful. We wrote an article for the Orlando Sentinel for their old Sunday magazine. And for years afterwards, people would say to me, I've always wanted to do that trip. I'm like, go do it. And then when I got involved in a nonprofit documentary group, we decided to use that framework to tell the story of the St. Johns River. We would tell the story of Marjorie, but we would also tell the story of the history of the St. Johns River. And it became a PBS documentary in Marjorie's wake. The picture on the left was painted by Jake Glisson, who was Rollins' neighbor as a little boy, and he became a commercial artist later on, so I really treasure that. And this is what happened. I owned a boat, and I knew how to drive it, so I ended up in the documentary. That was not my plan at all, but it was a really fun trip. In 2006, we go back down the St. Johns River. We put in at Christmas at Highway 50, and then we chart what we see along the way, and it was really fun. And so the longer impact is after I did all this project, I was invited to start adjuncting at Rollins College. I ended up going back very late in life to get my PhD, and now I teach Rollins in my classes, so she and I have a very long connection that I treasure very much. I haven't been able to talk to you about all the chapters in the book, so here's some that we didn't get to. Hernando de Soto's travels in 1539 through Florida. There were 3 people on that trip who kept accounts, which makes it really fascinating. Jonathan Dickinson, who is in a shipwreck off the shores of Hope Sound now, or Jupiter, and who marches with his family up the coast to St. Augustine, and the whole time he's terrified that they're going to be killed because they're English colonists, but the native people there had aligned with the Spanish in St. Augustine, but he does survive and writes about it. James Ingraham is part of a group that has a great idea. Let's take a trip from Fort Myers to Miami in a straight line, and we're going to survey it, and we're going to put for possible telegraph lines or maybe a rail line. And as you can imagine, it just doesn't go the way they think. They're going to do it in 12 days. They run out of food. I mean, it becomes a real disaster. And it's just a real tale of like assuming you know everything when you really, really don't. And the dangers of the Everglades. There's a whole chapter about West Florida and different people who visited there, including Andrew Jackson, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, but interestingly, Laura Ingalls Wilder came there. Of the Little House on the Prairie fame. Her husband wasn't well. They thought moving to Florida might be good for his health. Turned out not so much. He had relatives there. She didn't really write about it, but her daughter wrote a short story about, it seemed like thinly disguised, the horrors of being in Florida with this crazy family. So it's really interesting for interesting research. So these are the chapters in my book, Tracing Florida Journeys. My grandson Palmer highly recommends it. And I have time. Do we have time to take some questions? Okay, great. And I've only skimmed the surface here, so I'm happy to answer your questions. And I know you're my people, so you probably have stories to tell me. Yes, sir.
On your boat trip, how far north on the St. Johns did you go?
We went all the way to the Ocklawaha, and then we went all the way to the dam that stopped the path. And then we came back and went through the locks that are there and then into the old Ocklawaha. So we were there. They said they did it in about 10 days. We did it in about 7, 8 days. They were camping. You get to camp on the St. Johns River, right? You don't do that now. Yeah. So we kind of had to plot out where we were going.
Sure.
Yeah. It's a great trip. Highly recommend. Yes, ma'am?
Was Marjorie Rollins the first woman to be sued for slander?
Well, yes, and we know this because, so in Cross Creek, Rawlings uses her journalism. Actually, she did it in all of her books. She just went and interviewed people and put their stories in her books. And in Cross Creek, she goes out on a trip with her friend Zelma to do a census of the people in the local county. And she writes all about it, and she uses everybody's real names, and she talks about Zelma being kind of an angry canary who might have been a man in another life, and she's also very profane, right? Oh yes. Well, nobody else seemed to care about it. All the other people who portrayed, and I have to say some of them probably couldn't read. I mean, some of the people, but Zelma did, and she filed a lawsuit and claimed invasion of privacy and slander. Or libel. And ultimately, it ends up in a big court case. It goes to appellate court, to the Supreme Court. It goes over like 5 years. Rawlings becomes very depressed about this and spends a lot of money. And ultimately, the Supreme Court decides, yes, she did invade her privacy and awards her, I think it was $1. Desi actually went and testified during the trial and they said, was this an accurate description of Zelma? She goes, yeah, I think she did a good job. So, but we do know now that she and Zelma did reconcile at the end of their life. And so they did become friends again. But it still stands as case law in Florida. And you know now that if you want to use someone's name in a book or a film or whatever, you got to sign a release, right, to do that. So yeah, it's a really interesting story. Yeah. Thank you. Are you a lawyer? Oh, yeah. There's lawyers who always want to make reference to it. There's been a whole book written about it too. It's really fascinating. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, then wait. I want to indulge me in one thing, real quick. I like to do this. So there's a scene, and I put it at the end of my book, in which John James Audubon is in Key West, and he's looking at a sunset. And I think we're all sunset people, right? So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes while I read this, and you tell me if he paints a good portrait of a sunset, okay? If you have never seen the sun setting in those latitudes, I would recommend to you to make a voyage for the purpose. For I much doubt if in any other portion of the world the departure of the orb of day is accompanied with such gorgeous appearances. Look at the great red disk, increased to triple its ordinary dimensions. Now it has partially sunk beneath the distant line of waters, and with its still remaining half, irradiates the whole heavens with a flood of golden light. purpling the far-off clouds that hover over the western horizon. A blaze of refulgent glory streams through the portals of the west, and the masses of vapor assume the semblance of mountains of molten gold. But the sun has now disappeared, and from the east slowly advances the gray curtain which nigh draws over the world. I really wish I had written that.
Join me in thanking Leslie Poole.